I'm delighted to talk about the exciting topic of space exploration, providing you with a strategic outlook for this sector. As you know, space exploration is gaining increasing momentum, and we are now at a turning point. As we're going to see during this webinar, this decade promises the rise of multiple initiatives, potentially marking the beginning of a new era for space exploration. However, as we all know, we're currently living in unprecedented times with the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis associated with it. And similar to other sectors and areas, this may create challenges for these exploration initiatives. In this context, during this webinar, in the next 20 minutes, we will cover the following topics. What are the key drivers and trends in space exploration, including prospects for the sector? A discussion on the potential impact of the current global crisis on the prospects in government investment. And finally, we will provide some key takeaways from today's discussion. And jumping now into the topic of today's webinar, and more in particular, talking about the global context for space exploration. Well, I'm sure that almost everybody who is listening already has a very good understanding of the history of space exploration, so I'm not gonna go into the historical details. However, I would like to start by highlighting how the drivers and approaches to space exploration activities have evolved over time. As we know, space exploration activities started decades ago in the early 60s, and it was driven at the time by pure competition, that space race between the US and the Soviet Union. And over time, this evolved into a more collaborative approach until we reached the International Space Station era, an era of international collaboration. And we have seen that increase in collaboration, not only in human spaceflight, but also in science and planetary exploration missions. And more recently, we have also started seeing an increase in commercial activities over the past years. And moving forward, looking at the global context, we are entering now into what we consider a new era of both collaboration and competition, also joined now by the private sector. The global vision for space exploration focuses now on establishing a sustainable human and robotic presence on and around the moon in this decade as a pathway to Mars. And we see numerous initiatives that they are now starting to materialize, like for instance, the Artemis programs in the US. And why the moon? Well, the strategic value of the moon plays an important role behind the rationale for this vision, and it is also considered as a central item to achieve future human missions to Mars. And when looking into future plans, leading space agencies also agree on the importance of maintaining a sustained presence in low Earth orbit, LEO orbit, with increasing participation of the private sector, while also continuing to support astronomy and planetary missions to Mars and other deep space destinations to continue expanding our scientific knowledge and technical capabilities. Analyzing now more in detail the previous decade, we can see that the total global government investment in space exploration has been increasing until reaching a peak of nearly 20 billion in 2019. This increase has been driven by programs in leading countries and also joined by an increasing number of factors in this field. In 2019, over 30 countries contributing to this global investment. And as we can see here, the US remains by far the leading investor, accounting for over 70% of the total global funding itself, followed by China with 13%, Europe, including ESA national European programs with 9%, and others. What I was saying before, the space exploration is gaining the attraction not only of an increasing number of governments around the world, but also the private sector. So we see now players from startups to large companies active in these fields in different applications and with different business models. And this increase in commercial activities has been fostered by several factors, including public-private partnership programs, increasing private investment, and other initiatives, such as the expired Google Lunar X Prize in the case of lunar lander activities. And when we look at the timeline, the roadmap for private activities in space exploration, we see multiple success cases for the commercial sector, such as the commercial resupply services through ISS, or companies that now commercialize on a regular basis microgravity research and other services on board ISS, and so on. But we have also seen the challenges of the private sector and the exit of some commercial players as they failed to raise enough capital and be financially sustainable. And in fact, despite there has been an increase in private funding in the past years, the total private investment in space exploration continues to be to date moderate and rather concentrated only on a limited number of factors. Support from the government as a customer and partner remains critical to the success of commercial initiatives, especially for new and emerging markets. And in view of this rise of commercial activities, governments are also looking to increase the partnership with the private sector to conduct future exploration activities. Public-private cooperation, in a broad sense, is consolidating as a central item in the exploration roadmap of governments, both for LEO and lunar activities, through different cooperation schemes. So, for instance, through traditional public-private partnership programs like the COTS, the Commercial Crew Development Program, through initiatives where the government acts as a customer of commercial services, like the upcoming NASA CLIPS program for the delivery of lunar services, payload delivery, commercial resupply services to ISS or the Gateway, and so on. And why this increase in public-private cooperation? Well, for governments, some of the key motivations include ensuring access to technologies and services while fostering the growth of their domestic industry, sharing costs and sharing risk with the overall goal of fostering a sustainable model for space exploration. And for companies at the same time, partnering with the government enables them to access know-how, resources, and financial support, gain credibility in front of potential customers and investors, while ensuring also a potential revenue stream. But of course, while cooperation brings multiple benefits, it also brings significant challenges because it requires both parties to have a mutual understanding of the expectations and responsibilities. When involving co-funding schemes, activities should offer potentially viable and profitable business. So the private partner has incentive to invest. And cooperation, of course, can also be challenged by a change of in government priorities and funding allocations. Talking now in detail about some of what are the key trends by application. I will not cover all the details in this slide. You will have access to the content afterwards. But I would like to highlight some of the key trends in the 6 application areas that we assessed in our analysis. So starting with orbital infrastructure, as we all know, the ISM has been and continues to be the cornerstone program for human spaceflight. And support has grown to extend operations to 2028 or 2030 in cooperation with the private sector. ISI's partners are now planning the Lunar Gateway in the coming years, which will become the next largest program, international program beyond the orbit. And in the meantime, China has ramped up investments to ensure the launch of its space station starting next year. In transportation, which includes both crew and cargo transportation for LEO and beyond LEO orbit, we have lived a couple of weeks ago all the excitement of the first crew flights for the commercial crew program to enter now soon into operational phase. And meanwhile, multiple countries, including US, Russia, Japan, China, are developing next generation transportation capabilities to support LEO and lunar activities. With regards to lunar exploration, we have an inception period in the past years of this new wave of lunar exploration, which, as we're going to see in a minute, will drive new robotic missions in the decade, many of them in partnership with the private sector. For mass exploration, 2020, and in particular this summer, will mark an important time with 3 missions to be launched by the US, UAE, and China, now with ESA's ExoMars pushed to 2022. New priorities for this application, such as like Mars sample return missions, should drive new investment cycles towards the second part of the decade. And meanwhile, multiple missions are also being planned to other deep space destinations, including Jupiter, Venus, asteroids, and also next generation missions are also being planned for astronomy, astrophysics, and heliophysics, with investments currently in a peak phase to support the launch of flagship missions in the near terms, such as the awaited James Webb Space Telescope. And with all these plans in mind to achieve the planned goals, global government investment for space exploration is anticipated to grow and to reach nearly 30 billion by 2029. So this represents a funding growth of about 50% over the coming decade. And that reflects the government support to these large scale ambitious plans that have the moon as a core focus. As we can see here, orbital infrastructure and transportation will remain the largest applications in terms of funding, driven by lunar-related programs such as the Lunar Gateway, the SLS, Human Landing Systems, as well as LEO projects, including the ISS and Chinese Space Station. Astronomy, astrophysics, and heliophysics programs will continue to be an essential application area for space agencies worldwide, and will continue to rank third in terms of investment. And in terms of growth, moon exploration is anticipated to experience the highest sustained growth over the decade. This will support, as we mentioned before, future robotic government missions and commercial partnership programs. And regarding missions, considering also all this plan, we forecast a considerable increase in the number of missions with respect to the previous decade, 130 versus 52 in the past. Moon exploration will dominate with close to 40% of the total missions, reflecting that the moon is the core focus. Astronomy and heliophysics missions will represent over 35% of the total, and this is largely driven partially due to the rise in the number of small-sat missions dedicated to this application. And what is interesting to notice here also is the potential rise of commercial initiatives. Commercial missions are anticipated to account for 80% of the total, also driven by donor initiatives. And until now, we have talked about the global projected plans in space exploration. However, as I was mentioning at the beginning, we're now living in challenging times, and with the current pandemic and economic crisis associated with it, and that can have an impact. In this section, we analyze what could be the potential impact of the current crisis on government investment for the decade. I should emphasize, of course, that the specific impact as of today is still difficult to predict. So it's uncertain how funding allocations will fully develop, but we try to assess what can be this impact through these three potential scenarios. The first one corresponds to the initial projected forecast, pre-COVID, let's say. The second scenario represents a delayed version of the previous one. And the third case corresponds to a decade-long slowdown corresponding to revised ambitions in space exploration. So looking now more in detail at each one of them. Scenario one, as I was mentioning, this first scenario corresponds to the initial projected forecast. It includes a high increase in the global funding in the near and medium term to achieve key strategic lunar-related milestones, such as those for the Lunar Gateway program, the US Moon 2024 landing objective, as well as LEO programs, like the completion of the Chinese Space Station. It also anticipates a gradual uptake of lunar activities towards the second part of the decade, as well as continued support of further robotic planetary and science missions through the decade. Moving to scenario two, the second scenario reflects a slowdown in investment in the medium term as a consequence of the economic downturn caused by the current crisis. It takes into consideration, however, that the goals and ambitions for space exploration, even if delayed, they will be maintained. So therefore, it anticipates that some readjustments, a high increase will follow to achieve the overall goals for the decade. So thinking a bit more, what can be the implications of this scenario? This slowdown could imply a potential deferment on certain projects in the medium term. It would impose greater challenges to achieve those key strategic milestones targeted for early and middle of the decade, as we were mentioning. It would require also a prioritization of investment, a choice between applications. Since Moon is a priority, lunar-related programs may be favored compared to other applications. And as economic pressure increases, co-funding, and with that, international and public-private collaboration will become even more important. Although at the same time, of course, commitment from partners may be challenged due to the economic downturn. And our third scenario assumes a case where public finances are seriously damaged due to the crisis and take longer to recover. As a consequence, governments might need to take more severe austerity measures, and the current ambitions and plans are scaled down, leading to a reduced investment through the decade. This scenario would imply that even if the overall long-term goals prevail, the objective of a sustainable return to the moon, for instance, for the decade, might be further pushed. It would require even more selective investment choices by governments between application programs, potentially leading to considerably less emissions through the decade. And it will imply also greater difficulties for partnerships as pressures in financing will be high. And that in turn can have a detrimental impact in the current momentum for space exploration. And now that we introduce the three scenarios, and before we go to the key takeaways, we would like to do a poll to have your opinion on what of these three scenarios, in your view, are more likely to happen. This is scenario 1, 2, or 3. So I see the poll here coming on the screen. We'll leave it there. And just some key takeaways of today's presentation. Well, we're currently at a turning point for the space exploration sector, with numerous government and also commercial activities being planned with the moon as a core focus. Collaboration, both international and public-private collaboration, will continue to consolidate as an essential requisite to achieve a sustainable model for space exploration. Commitments from partners, however, might be challenged by the current context, as they may face difficulties to secure the necessary funding and resources. And overall, while the current crisis might impact and delay some plans, long-term objectives will likely be maintained due to the strategic importance of space exploration and the moon in particular. And with that, well, I look forward to the results of to get a couple of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia, for your presentation. And indeed, just allow me to start with the poll results. About 65% of our attendees have voted so far, and in the lead is scenario 2 with 55% of the votes, followed with scenario 3 for revised ambitions at 29%.
Okay, yes, okay, so scenario 2. So yeah, indeed, I think considering the situation as of today, of course, we need to see how the crisis evolves and the decisions taken in the next months. But yeah, I believe that we will see some type of scenario 2, where even if there is a slowdown due to the economic crisis, we will see like those goals, right, and ambitions that I was mentioning, we will maintain due to the high strategic importance that space exploration has gained. And we will see increasing investment as economies recover.
Thank you for that comment. And just to start our Q&A now, if you haven't sent us your questions yet, you could still do so using the Q&A button on your screen. And just allow me to kickstart with a first question that is perhaps on a lot of people's minds, considering that the US is one of the main contributors for space exploration with 71% of the market share. Everybody knows that the US will have elections in November. So one of the questions that might be on people's mind is whether we're expecting any changes to the space exploration budget if we are to have a change in the US administration.
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. So as we saw and you pointed out, the US is the largest investor by far, and is a major driving force, right, when defining the global strategy for space exploration. So the outlook for the sector will be largely influenced, by the steps taken and decisions taken in the next month. So as we saw in the past, space exploration has been traditionally very tied to US politics, as every new administration defines new objectives. So we saw that when the focus changed from the moon to Mars with an asteroid as a stepping stone, moon again. However, the overall Moon to Mars campaign has gained increasing bipartisan support. And what is different now than it was before is that global converging focus interest on the moon. So the moon has gained that strategic and geopolitical importance for many countries around the world, including China. And that might be a key factor for the US to maintain a lunar focus in its exploration program, even if there is a change of administration. That said, of course, if there is a potential change in administration, there will be questions on the timeline, right, of projects. So, for example, the Lunar Gateway, the moon landing objective, and so on, that can be that could be delayed, and that can have implications, right, for international and private partners.
And also, Natalia, we've seen a lot of, we're also seeing, in addition to government investment, we're also seeing quite a bit of new entrants and new actors. And we were talking about the different scenarios of the crisis, and what, in your opinion, you know, what effect will the current crisis, in your opinion, will have on the private sector?
Yeah. So if we look at the current context right now, so as I was mentioning in the presentation, there has been an increase on private funding, right? But when you compare to other sectors, to other areas of space, it remains somehow limited and concentrated, right? So investors remain more reluctant to invest in exploration activities due to the high risk and the long-term vision of the field. So this might be, so the current crisis may accentuate that, so basically creating more barriers, more challenges for startups to raise private financing in the near term. And also that may create also barriers to new entrants, new companies that may want to join the field. And as I was mentioning before, support for the government, I mean, has been and will continue to be essential for the support of commercial initiatives, especially for those very new and emerging markets, right, that are in this situation.
And thank you for your thoughts on that, Natalia. And still keeping the subject a bit in this economic crisis scenarios that we're currently finding ourselves as an industry. Another question is, because the sector has had different economic crises in the past, and some of the questions that are coming in are reflecting on how is this particular crisis different from the past ones that we've had in the sector?
Yeah. Okay, good question. So, well, the current crisis, right? It's still going. As I say, like we need to see how it evolves. When looking at the past, or the space sector, right, is not immune to the international context and global economic context. So when looking in the past, right, after the period of financial crisis, that could be like the 2008, for instance, we saw a slowdown, right, or decrease. That's more noticeable or not, depending on the country and depending on application areas. In space exploration, yeah, there was a slowdown, but also the greater variations in budget have been due to the end of programs. So for example, the end of the shuttle program, right, in 2011, with that drop in human spaceflight, as well the change in priorities. So what is now different as before, as I was mentioning, is that now there is this converging vision, right, after like beyond the orbit, and that space exploration has consolidated as a field of high strategic importance. So linking also to what I was saying before, even if we might see that slowdown, right, in the near and medium term, after probably we will see again like investments increasing again to support those high ambitions that governments have now. But of course, yeah, as I said, we will need to, right, it's also largely dependent on how this crisis evolves and the decisions, right, and the steps taken in the next month.
Thank you for that, Natalia.